Dear panelists, dear members of the DGAP, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rolf Nikel. I'm the Vice President of the German Council on Foreign Relations, and it's an honor and a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the German Council on Foreign Relations to our digital conference, Cybersecurity and Diplomacy 2022, What to Expect. In an increasingly digitized world, cyber threats have become pervasive. Cybersecurity is a critically important matter to many decision makers around the world, especially in those countries which have experienced major attacks on their governments or critical infrastructure systems. In a number of countries, cyber has become a military domain even, raising a lot of serious considerations. Against this backdrop, a number of concrete international activities are underway at the UN and at regional level with a view to securing cyberspace for the benefit of mankind. So in our conference today, we want to look at challenges in the near future, as well as at attempts to regulate new cyber technology at the international level. The open-ended working group on developments in the field of information and telecommunication in the context of international security and the UN Cybercrime Treaty negotiations kicking off in January will be of key importance in this respect. We are very happy that our tech program has managed to pull together such a distinguished panel with so many interesting participants, all of whom I want to wholeheartedly thank for their preparedness to make time in their busy schedules to participate in today's conference. First of all, I want to warmly welcome Nathalie Jaarsma, Ambassador at Large for Security Policy and Cyber at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Jaarsma joined the ministry in 2001, and prior to her current posting, she served as Dutch ambassador to Cyprus. Before joining the Foreign Service, she worked in Thailand and the Netherlands, primarily in IT, telecoms, and the petrochemical industry. Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for being with us. I also have the pleasure to welcome Heli Tirmaa-Klaaar, Ambassador at Large for Cyber Diplomacy at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to her previous posting, she served as Head of Cyber Policy Coordination at the European External Action Service. Among other things, she was responsible for developing the EU cyber strategy and for the implementation of the EU cyber defense policy framework. Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for joining us from Tallinn, I presume. Next, I'm happy to welcome Dimitri Alperovitch, who is the co-founder and executive chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a non-profit organization focused on advancing solutions to critical geopolitical and cybersecurity policy challenges. Dimitri Alperovitch has served as a special advisor to the US Department of Defense. He has a plethora of academic and innovation distinctions. Recently, Johns Hopkins University named its Cybersecurity Institute after him. Thank you very much, Dimitri Alperovitch, for participating in our conference today. Also, it's my great honor and privilege to welcome and introduce to you Michael Chertoff, the former US Secretary of Homeland Security. Secretary Chertoff now is executive chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group, a global advisory firm that provides business strategy, risk management, mergers and acquisitions advisory services to clients around the world. Prior to his career in the US Department of Homeland Security, he served as a federal judge and in the US Department of Justice. Thank you very much, Secretary Chertoff, for being with us today. Last but not least, I'm happy to welcome, I hope he's in now, a former colleague of mine, John Reyels. He has been head of the cyber coordination staff in the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs since January 2021. He served at our embassies in Warsaw and Dar es Salaam and in the press, legal, and arms control sections of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much, John, for being with us. Today's conference will be moderated by Valentin Weber. Valentin is a research fellow at DGAP's Technology and Global Affairs program, where he leads the project on cyber norms. Thank you very much for leading today's discussion. Now it's time to wish you all an exciting afternoon and fruitful debates on an extremely important subject. Without further ado, I hand it over to the moderator. Valentin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rolf Nikel, for the welcome remarks. This session is on the record. We will start with questions for our speakers that will be moderated by me. Afterwards, we'll have some time allocated for Q&A. On the lower side of your screen, you can see a Q&A icon where you can ask your questions, or you can also raise your hands later on when we will have the dedicated session, dedicated part for that. We do have many topics to cover and a fantastic panel to work through them. As Rolf Nikel has already mentioned, there were many issues that have kept us awake at night in 2021, and one of the most pressing issues being ransomware attacks. Ambassador Jaarsma, Ben Knappen, the Dutch Minister for Foreign Affairs, recently replied to a parliamentary inquiry into the possible avenues of response by the Netherlands to ransomware attacks, and that he's also considering involving the Dutch armed forces to combat ransomware in specific cases. Could you maybe elaborate what you think the future role of the military should be in countering cyber threats?
Yeah, thank you so much, Valentin. And first of all, let me thank Rolf Nikel, Valentin, and the German Council of Foreign Relations for this opportunity. Indeed, Valentin, this was a question by two members of our national parliament. And please allow me to elaborate a bit on that letter, also to correct some of the things that were in the press shortly after it was published. The letter actually focuses on possible diplomatic responses to ransomware, and it touches on the role of other parts of the government. And for every assessment on malicious cyber activities, including ransomware, and that requires a case-by-case approach, our starting point is international law and the normative framework that has been agreed by consensus by the entire UN membership. International law applies to states, not to criminals. And so the question arises if proxies, so the ransomware attackers, can be proved to be working on behalf of a state. And if so, this could mean that the ransomware attack constitutes a breach of international law. And any reaction to that, be it from the military or from another national actor, should be proportionate. In case legal attribution is impossible, one could also look at the due diligence principle. If a state can reasonably know that ransomware actors are operating from their soil, that state should act upon this. That's roughly the due diligence principle. Another ground under international law is necessity. And under certain very strict conditions, necessity offers justification for an act that would otherwise be deemed internationally wrongful, such as deploying offensive cyber capabilities against another state. So that is my first answer to your question on the role of the military. The 11 norms, as agreed by the UN General Assembly, also provide scope for addressing ransomware attacks and holding states to those norms. There is again the due diligence as a norm, and there is a norm that states should not intervene in each other's critical infrastructure. And of course, a lot of ransomware is not aimed at critical infrastructure. However, the attacks that are impacting the critical infrastructure can form a threat to national security. And that is when the government has other response options at its disposal, such as the intel services and the armed forces. And for example, ICT infrastructure that has been used in an attack or for cyber espionage or sabotage can be taken offline. In addition, the government can involve the armed forces in its response. For example, the Defense Cyber Command can, as a last resort, carry out a counterattack to avert a hostile operation or protect an essential interest of the state. A military counterattack must be predicated on an international legal ground, such as necessity, as I mentioned before. And in the Netherlands, it must also be based on a cabinet's decision. Thank you. Back to you, Valentin.
Thank you so much for this, this really insightful and actually quite informative answer, which shows that we have a lot of legal considerations before states engage in everything in that. This is very a thought-through process, at least in the Netherlands, maybe not in most countries, but in the Netherlands for sure, and that there are also different institutions for different kind of attacks, and that this needs to be evaluated also very carefully to have sufficient information to then engage a process of countering those threats. If we stay with ransomware, Dimitri Alperovitch, if we look back at the year 2021, it was characterized by some as the year of ransomware. Some states have responded to this increasing threat by coordinating with each other. Actually, very recently, we've seen that a group of states, or like-minded states, has joined forces in hacking the ransomware group Reyels and forcing it to go offline. This seems to indicate a first reaction, but what more has to happen so we won't have to label the year 2022 also the year of ransomware?
Well, thank you, Valentin, for having me. It's great to be with you all. Let me first say that we don't have a ransomware problem. In many ways, we have a Russia problem because much of this ransomware originates from the borders of the Russian Federation. That is not to say that the Russian government has been implicated in any of these attacks, but the criminals there are clearly allowed to operate with impunity, with the Russian government so far failing to take any action against them. There was a case just yesterday of an investigation done by the Daily Mail into one of the criminals who was an affiliate of Reyels, who has collected millions of dollars in ransom and was recently indicted by the US government. He was found living by the Daily Mail in Barnaul, Russia, which is a city in Siberia, having houses and luxury cars, and claiming that he has not even been contacted by Russian law enforcement. So we have a situation where UK British paper is doing the work that the FSB apparently is unable to do in terms of finding criminals that are living in the open, not even attempting to hide, and he has not even been questioned, much less arrested or prosecuted by the Russian government. So there's a clear policy by the Russian government, at least so far, to not take any action against these criminals. It could be done for a variety of reasons. I won't get into that speculation right now of why, but the reality is that until we can get President Putin and the Russian security services to start taking this seriously and to start to appreciate that this situation is untenable and is not actually even in the interest of Russia. When you think about the fraught relationship that currently exists between Russia and the United States, Russia and the European Union, it's pretty clear that whatever you think of President Putin's policies, he wants to be in control of any escalation in that relationship. And the reality is that as long as ransomware is allowed to operate freely from the borders of the Russian Federation, he is not going to be in control. Literally, some individual in Barnaul who decide, or even by accident, can attack a critical infrastructure company that takes down, a major pipeline on the East Coast, as we saw with Colonial back in May of this year, or a major meat processor, as we saw with JBS in June, or any type of other critical infrastructure company with national impact, is going to automatically throw the entire productive side of the relationship between Russia and the West out the window, regardless of what President Putin thinks about that or whether he finds that desirable or not. So for Russia to be in control of that relationship and in control of escalation, they need to get these criminals under control, and we need to convince them of that. Otherwise, I'm afraid significant progress is not attainable. Now, that's not to say that the diplomatic efforts should be the only measures that we should be taking against ransomware. The Biden administration, as you mentioned, has focused on internationalizing the problem because ransomware does affect almost every major state out there, by the way, including Russia, which has suffered some ransomware attacks, although fairly few in number compared to others. But nevertheless, most states, most businesses, most nonprofit organizations, schools, hospitals, in many advanced countries have been targeted by ransomware. So it's this scourge that needs to be dealt with on a national level. And the White House recently, about 6 weeks ago, convened a summit of 30 plus nations to figure out a strategy, international strategy of how to combat ransomware. And in addition to diplomacy, they focused on a number of areas. One, as you might imagine, is law enforcement. How do we find these criminals? Because even though the majority of the kingpins, the folks that are key to these operations are located in Russia, many others, the foot soldiers, if you will, the affiliates of these ransomware groups are not. So we have seen arrests just in the last few weeks in Romania. We have seen an arrest in Poland of a Ukrainian national. We've seen an arrest in Kuwait. We've seen Russians that have been arrested in other countries where they've traveled to, such as Latvia and South Korea. So more aggressive law enforcement, more aggressive prosecution globally is absolutely critical to helping to address this issue. But the other side of it is cyber offensive action. And as I've written in several op-eds in the Washington Post and New York Times in the last few months, I've argued that this right strategy from an offensive perspective needs to go after people, needs to go after money, and needs to go after infrastructure of these criminal groups. The people are the most important. And if you look at the Reyels operation that you referred to just now, the success of that operation was not in the ability of Cyber Command, as been reported, to go after and shut down the website of Reyels. The success was in getting Reyels to appreciate that their infrastructure has been hacked and that someone was trying to get close enough to identify their individual identities to uncover who they are. And that's what ultimately scared them off and got them to voluntarily, at least for now, to shut down the operation, because ultimately they didn't care about the fact that their website is down. They cared about someone uncovering their identities, someone being able to arrest them, issue Interpol red notices on them, preventing them from travel, perhaps potentially seizing their funds. That's what really impacts these groups, not taking down some server that can be rebuilt in a matter of hours. And that's what they're really afraid of. And we need to see more operations against that. The US government has done a number of operations now as well to seize ransoms, to get back part of the colonial ransom that was paid in May, get back a ransom from the Kaseya attacks. And more needs to be done there in terms of tracing the cryptocurrency transfers that are used for these ransom payments, and ultimately seize the wallets that are involved in these criminal attacks. And finally, on the cryptocurrency side, we're seeing countries now start moving forcefully on the regulatory side. And there are a number of things that are driving that, of course, ransomware being only one factor. The reality is that a lot of ransomware operations are being used for nefarious purposes, whether it's drug trafficking, money laundering, tax evasion, what have you. So there is a huge need to shine the law enforcement light on these financial transactions and enforce KYC, your customer regulations, enforce anti-money laundering regulations globally, and sanction any cryptocurrency exchange that is not doing that type of vetting on their customers and their transactions. The US government has taken some initial actions in that space, sanctioned several exchanges that are Moscow-based, that are facilitating these cryptocurrency ransom payments to these criminal groups. But much more needs to be done by a collective group of nations that want to tackle this problem to make it much harder for these criminals to monetize their operations. At the end of the day, it is not an accident that ransomware emerged at scale only after the invention of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. The reality is that the technical capabilities of doing ransomware have existed for many decades. In fact, the first ransomware attack ever recorded happened in 1990, well over 30 years ago. But the reason why that scheme did not take off is that in order to collect the ransom, the criminals would leave a note saying, please transfer money to this bank account. And of course, that would be, even in those days, fairly easily traceable by law enforcement, and you can identify who's behind that bank account and shut off those money transfers at a minimum and arrest the individual at a maximum. Cryptocurrency solved that problem for the criminals, because now they could receive those funds in pseudo-anonymous fashion without being revealing their identities. And we need to de-anonymize cryptocurrency for these illicit transactions with KYC and ML regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. That was a tour de force through how to tackle the ransomware problem. We have multilateral venues about which we will be talking about in a little bit. So many avenues actually to tackle the problem, and actually we should probably go for all of them, right? To be more stringent when it comes to taking down infrastructure money, people, as you say. Also more law enforcement actions. It's interesting that they still travel, cyber criminals, to Poland, Kuwait, and Romania sometimes, even during pandemic times, or maybe they're already located there. And maybe we can later look as well more into cryptocurrency regulation, how that could further undermine those operations when we have time later. But now we'll turn towards the multilateral level. And here I'll ask John Reyels a question on the Cybercrime Convention negotiations, which are starting in January of 2022. What topics will be especially contentious, which are likely to pass without major debates? And what sections do liberal democracies need to give special attention to in the coming year? John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valentin, and thank you for taking me on board for this panel. I'm happy to give you a brief overview of the most critical aspects in these cybercrime negotiations that are coming up in January indeed. Though preparation are already quite intense right now, taking place mainly in Vienna. Actually, we can think of quite a number of critical aspects in the context of such a convention. For example, the extent of state responsibility when undertaking cybercrime investigation, the level of authorizations for government interventions online, and the protection of free speech online. I think what we really need to do is when we formulate cybercrime offenses that should be part of the future convention, we need to be very clear about the kind of things that should be criminalized. What would be very difficult or very dangerous is if we ended up with a wishy-washy text that invite for broad interpretation, and that could then result in broad powers for state intervention. We need to be particularly sensitive in this respect when it comes to freedom of speech. We don't want the future convention to be used as a pretext for cracking down on NGOs or on political opposition. So I think this is one major thing that we need to be very clear about. We need to ensure that whatever is criminalized under the new convention needs to be put into very clear language in order to prevent authoritarian states from taking the broadest possible interpretation in order to expand their own powers online. What we also need to do is look at the Cybercrime Convention process in the wider context of the multilateral negotiations going on inside the UN. We will be talking about the negotiations in the open-ended working group in a moment, I believe. And the open-ended working group is, of course, the process for us, the main process inside the United Nations in which we would like to advance the framework of responsible state behavior. And we need to make sure that we don't see binding regulation introduced via the cybercrime process that would negatively impact on the framework of responsible state behavior, which we want to further advance in the first committee. So I think this is why we need to take such a close look at the cybercrime process. At first glance, you could say, well, this is just about fighting crime. So why do we even need to take such a close look at it? But then you actually see that via that process, you would be able to introduce binding regulation that can set a precedence or set binding standards for state powers online. And this would then be binding also in many other aspects of the internet. So that's why we have really started to focus on this, the Cybercrime Convention. And it's also why it will not just be the Ministry of Justice leading those negotiations from the German side, but we will also make sure that, that professional diplomats will be involved, because it's become such a highly politicized process. And what's also very interesting is that even before the first day of the negotiations starting in New York, Russia has already put the text of a full convention on the table. It has already presented its draft convention to everyone, expecting that that will be the basis of negotiations going forward. And that's another thing that we need to make absolutely sure, is that we guard the transparency and the inclusiveness of the future process. What we really want to see is have an open debate in the negotiations, and then have the chair summarize the input from all states and come up with a zero draft from the chair, and not use the draft of a single country as a basis for negotiation. So there are many challenges ahead, both procedural and substantive, and that's what we're going to focus on next year.
Thank you so much for those insights and actually quite hands-on approaches of how we should go about next year. We also saw the irony here of the situation where Dimitri has mentioned that actually Russia doesn't really help to get a hand on the most tangible criminals that are out there. At the same time, we can see now what Don Reyels mentioned, that we actually had Russia taking such a quite proactive approach in negotiations, and perhaps we'll have to also highlight that irony a bit more in the future, and be quite actually attentive to perhaps look at also a zero draft and not take drafts by one country as a reflection of the entire community. So that's very valuable insights. On another international body, in the International Telecommunications Union, in September 22, actually, there will be an election for a new Secretary General. The current Secretary General is the Chinese national, Hu Lingzhao, and he will have, I think, finished his, if it's a second term, in the end of 2022. So in September 2022, will already finish. He will already have elections for a new candidate then to take over in the beginning of January 2023. So the International Telecommunication Union is actually quite often overlooked. It is a specialized agency of the UN, which is tasked with drafting technical standards. And for this question, I would like to ask Ambassador Heli Tirmaa-Klaaar, if you can tell us anything about the most promising candidates. What will we have to look out for there in those elections? What repercussions could these elections have?
Thank you for this timely question, and we certainly should keep our eye on the ITU, but be familiar with our more broader UN processes. I just would like to remind that we are seeing the processes in the ITU as part of general developments in the United Nations frameworks, where we increasingly see interest towards the digital and cyber issues. And there are several groups now created again. And John was just talking about the third committee ad hoc working group that is developing cybercrime convention. Also in the first committee, we will have a new group again gathering, and we will talk about this later. But we see the promotion of those issues in also other UN agencies and subcommittees, including ITU. And as the community of the like-minded nations, we should be vigilant and keep our eyes open to see whether some of those attempts to make these issues known and promoted at the multilateral level might lead to a situation where our current internet governance model might be changed. And I think that's our major, shall we call it, red line, why we are keeping the UN in our focus now and also in the future. So there is this old debate between the different communities dealing with internet governance, whether the current model, which has been decided, the multilateral, multi-stakeholder model, should be preserved, or should the internet also be allocated to a multilateral model as we have with telecommunications. This is a very old debate for those of you who have entered cyber issues recently. And there have been many milestones how this was decided, that with the creation of ICANN, the multi-stakeholder model was chosen and preferred. But it is continuously an uphill struggle on behalf of the like-minded community and the multi-stakeholder community to keep it that way, because we see the rising digital authoritarianism in the East. We see many authoritarian powers becoming technologically much more powerful, and also those becoming powerful are inevitably setting standards. And here in the ITU, we talk about standards. So our usual diplomatic discussions about whether international law applies and how we are implementing the norms of responsible state behavior and how we are following human rights obligations online. Instead of this, in ITU, we talk about standards. So they might be neutral and they might be very benign, familiar with the issues. But as we know, some of the technical details and some of the standard setting attempts might be actually the ones that will define the future of the internet and future of technology. So that's why it is an increasingly important task for the like-minded community to keep up with the work in the ITU and become also aware of those the processes that are there. And of course, the question who will lead this organization is more relevant than ever. Currently, we have a couple of good ideas and a strong like-minded candidate who might be a preference for all our European governments there. And we hope to line up to this like-minded nation that has represented the candidate. But as we know as well, all these multilateral processes and negotiations are not so clear-cut sometimes. And there are many expected and unexpected forces at play, what we have seen before. So I think we still are going to see a very hard working season in the UN in general and with the ITU elections in particular. Make sure that our interests to keep the internet open and free will be preserved in the long run.
Thank you so much, Heli. I think I'm not sure if you're finished now, but you were gone for a second, but we can come back to that later in a second if you want to continue on this point. We will now turn again more to cybersecurity on the ground and to some major cyber attacks. So the year 2021 was actually a year also of major supply chain hacks. I'm thinking here of the SolarWinds operation and the Cassia attack. So how do we ensure that supply chain attacks won't dominate the headlines in 2022? Are there any quick fixes? And I'm thinking here particularly of Secretary Chertoff, who has year-long experience of engaging with businesses and also from a government side on major threats, and especially also on supply chain attacks. Maybe you can elaborate on that point.
I'm happy to do so, Valentin, and good to hear from a lot of very, very well-informed individuals, many of whom I've had the pleasure of working with in the past. There's no question supply chain as a vulnerability has been very much in the news with good reason. And let me first define what we mean by supply chain. Obviously, a big part of that is vulnerabilities in software. And when we do find that software has an undiscovered vulnerability, it's usually because that's been used as the entry point for a cyber attack. So obviously diligence in terms of how we review and vet software code is critically important as one step in combating this kind of supply chain problem. But I should also mention that supply chain includes hardware. And as I'll talk a little bit about, I think increasingly there's a consciousness that the supplier of hardware infrastructure has a particular responsibility to make sure there's nothing embedded in that hardware that creates an opportunity for bad actors, including nation states, to use that as a key to enter into networks. And finally, supply chain also includes anybody that winds up accessing the network as a third party. One of the most well-known stories about this kind of challenge was Target, the big retailer in the US, which was hacked some years back because an HVAC, a heating and cooling contractor, connected up his particular tool, cyber tool, to the network in order to vet whether the heating and cooling system was working. Unbeknownst to him, he had a vulnerability and he infected the network, and ultimately there was a significant hack. So when you're dealing with the issue of supply chain, you're very much focused on all of these dimensions of what make up the ingredients of an operational network. But I think the more recent development that's captured in attention, as you've observed, is SolarWinds and Kaseya. These are cases where a managed services provider was infected, and that then created what I would call a skeleton key that allowed the bad actors to use the key to enter the network of anybody that was being managed through that managed service provider. So it's not necessarily the case that every customer was actually attacked, but essentially this opened up a battleground in which bad actors could at will choose to infect any network user that had relied on that managed service provider. And that means there's a special responsibility to make sure that before bringing an MSP on board to manage the network, you're comfortable that they have processes in place to vet the software on a continuous basis. And it also means the MSPs themselves have a responsibility to constantly make sure they are monitoring for potential attacks and flaws within their own products. In terms of the way the US is looking at this, we've now got a kind of philosophical approach called zero trust. And the idea behind zero trust, which has been adopted by the US government as a kind of model about how to proceed with cybersecurity, is not assuming that anything you put on your network is necessarily secure and safe, but to constantly review whether there needs to be a patching or an updating or some other kind of modification of what you are putting on your network. And at the same time, recognizing that you cannot eliminate risk for any one tool. So if you're building a cybersecurity architecture, you have to have multiple layers of defense. You have to be considering not only what's at your perimeter, but what you're monitoring inside your network, what is leaving your network, what training is being given to your employees in terms of what they download. The idea is to view multiple layers of defense as critical to achieving risk-managed cybersecurity. So I think that's the approach the US government is taking. And in particular, the Biden administration has put out an executive order that begins to lay out heightened expectations for software supply chain companies in terms of their rigor on secure software development, testing, constantly updating, and also being mindful of developments with respect to other software developers that might suggest new threats or new requirements. I also think that on a sector-specific focus, where we're dealing with particular economic sectors and critical infrastructure, the US government is beginning to create new regulations that will heighten requirements for the critical infrastructure operators to vet the software and hardware, which is part of what they are putting onto their networks. So for example, in the defense area, defense contractors are now responsible to verify that their subcontractors are providing secure products, both hardware and software. We're seeing increased requirements with respect to pipelines because of the Colonial Pipeline hack, air and rail carriers, and the financial sector. These in particular are being urged to be very mindful about constantly vetting what is getting on their networks. A couple of things would be very helpful as we move forward, again, in increasing our ability to deal with this problem. One is to have some kind of a certification mechanism that would allow enterprises and even individuals who don't have the ability on their own to really delve deeply into the quality of the software and hardware, to have some assurance that what they are buying or what they are downloading is trustworthy and secure. We have something with respect to hardware in this country called the Underwriters Laboratory, which certifies the quality of certain kinds of products and services so that an individual buying a product knows it's achieved at least a certain minimal security and safety operationally. If we could have a similar type of licensing and certification program in the cyber area, I think that would be helpful in making it more efficient. But the other, perhaps even more significant development is the recognition that as we build out our infrastructure for 5G and then ultimately 6G, who provides, monitors, updates, and manages the hardware and software at national scale has an enormous opportunity, but also can be an enormous threat in terms of security on a wide scale basis. This has come up in particular with the issue of the Chinese company Huawei, which has been very aggressive and has been subsidized by the Chinese government in pushing itself as a provider of software and hardware for operating 5G and 6G networks. The problem is that if we're not completely confident that they're going to operate the network in the interest of the customer as opposed to the interest of the Chinese government, we are really introducing a potential serious risk into our networks. And although there are some efforts being made to require disclosure of software code and to constantly vet the hardware, the fact is that when a foreign nation has the opportunity to update, monitor, repair, and have visibility into the operations of a major large-scale network, that does create some risky opportunities. As we've talked about whether Huawei ought to be restricted in terms of what it's allowed to do with respect to Western nations, one of the arguments I've constantly heard is, oh, what's the alternative? Huawei has good products, as far as we can tell, and it's subsidized and it's therefore more economically attractive. What is the West got? And I think this is why you're seeing in the US and with NATO allies in Japan, an increased focus on what I would call an industrial policy, helping to promote and build markets that incentivize investment in chips, in software, in other kinds of hardware that can be used to build 5G and 6G so that we are not totally dependent on one source of supply for operating our internet, but we have many alternatives. And if this needed to be underscored, the experience we had in the last 2 years with the pandemic, where we see how easy it is to subvert our economies when a supply chain is compromised or impeded, I mean, I think that lesson ought to make it clear that building a robust and resilient source of supply chain that's not dependent on one actor is a critical part of our national security. So with that, Valentin, I'm happy to turn it back.
Thank you so much, Michael. You have highlighted a couple of important issues that, for instance, in the supply chain, we have also to think, of course, also in the future about the 5G question, about trustworthy, untrustworthy suppliers, and that in any case, we have also to think about zero trust as a general principle to stay secure, because the supply chain attacks do allow to scale attacks and to increase the impact actually of any cyber operation, whether that's for attack or espionage purposes. Something we haven't touched upon yet and which has featured very prominently, at least since 2016, and much throughout the Cold War as well, actually, is the topic of election interference. In that respect, I'd like to turn back to Dimitri. The next year is full of elections. The South Korean presidential elections are scheduled for March 2022. The French presidential elections for April. And of course, as you all well know, is the US midterm elections, which will take place in November 2022. This schedule is probably also pinned to a wall in the GRU headquarters and also in other cyber actors' headquarters. Dimitri, what would you recommend democracies such as South Korea, France, and the US so that they can effectively defend the electoral process in 2022?
Look, I think the first thing we need to do is not overstate the threat. I actually don't think that the schedule is pinned in the GRU headquarters, because I don't actually think the GRU or the Russian government more broadly cares a whole lot about most of the elections that you just cited. The reality is that there was major interference by the Russians in 2016, but there really wasn't much interference in the following elections in 2018, midterms, or even the 2020 elections last year. And I don't necessarily expect them to interfere in every single election going forward. There were some very specific, very tactical reasons for why they felt it was important for them to jump in 2016 in the US, and 2017 in France. And I expect that, at a tactical level, that they'll make decisions about each one going forward, about whether it makes sense or not for them to do so, but they're not going to do it in every single situation. So let's not jump to conclusions and assume that every election from here to eternity is going to be interfered by the Russians or someone else. I think that's just not a realistic assessment of the threat. And when it comes to the interference, let's also be honest that the interference is fairly basic, and most of the time it actually doesn't work. When you look at the interference, the attempted interference in 2017 in France with the Macron election, it didn't work. They stole they hacked into some email accounts to try to do a repeat of 2016. They tried to leak it and time it just a few days before the French presidential election. What they didn't appreciate is that there was a widespread media blackout by law in France, so virtually no one actually covered any of the content of those emails, and the emails themselves were not controversial at all, so it was a big nothing. We saw the Iranians attempt to interfere in 2020 in the US with a very crude campaign attempting to spoof the Proud Boys, a white nationalist group here in the United States, proclaiming their support for Donald Trump, trying to suppress the vote for Trump in 2020. Also very crude, was immediately identified, was immediately disclosed by the US government. There was just an indictment of 2 Iranian nationals that was released by the Justice Department several weeks ago. So those things, it's not clear that they actually accomplished a whole lot. And I would argue that 2016 had a lot of elements of that interference, both on the social media side as well as on the hack and leak side, that came together to create sort of the big story about the major interference in that election by the Russians against a variety of different parties. And to the extent that it did work, I would say it worked more on the local level than the national level, where there were certain races for House seats in Florida and some other states that were very competitive, where the Russians leaking the opposition research that they had on some of those candidates to local newspapers perhaps had an effect in turning those races that were already very, very close. But that wasn't necessarily their strategy. That was more of an opportunistic thing when they hacked the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and they had all this opposition research that the Democrats themselves had collected on themselves. They didn't know necessarily what to do about it. And only when contacted actually by local media and bloggers in different states did they start releasing it to them, because they were just sitting on it, not knowing what to do. So I think we just need to be very, very circumspect about the effects, the true effects of these interference campaigns, and not make the Russians or anyone else, frankly, in this area seem like they're 10 feet tall.
Totally agreed, yeah. One shouldn't inflate threats, otherwise they become more than they are. actually seem to be in reality. So we have another question I would like to ask for Nathalie here, because we have already mentioned it for a couple of times about the OEWG, and right after that we will then drop into the Q&A section from the section that we have devoted to that. So the open-ended working group features also very importantly in cyber diplomacy, which the group discusses cybersecurity issues in the first committee of the UN. And it is kicking off in a few weeks' time, hopefully pandemic permitting. The process is aimed to last until 2025, so a couple of years, as you have mentioned already earlier in the pre-discussion of this panel. So what can we expect in this working group to happen? What are the topic areas which will be the most important and that we need to reach consensus in the next couple of years? The floor is yours, Nathalie.
Yeah, thank you, Valentin. And obviously my dear colleagues here, Heli and John, can also fill me in on this topic. But you're right, Valentin, we're really at an early stage. In December, we will start our substantial deliberations, but before we can really kick off, there's still a procedural point that we need to address, and that's the involvement of the multi-stakeholder community. In the previous iteration, the other stakeholders and government had a more informal role, and we and other countries would like to see that to be more formalized, so that their ideas can be taken on board in the formal process. And at least to have transparency if countries object against certain stakeholders to take part, because transparency is at the core of multilateralism and engagement in the UN, we believe. Then on substance, the UN General Assembly, as was mentioned before, has agreed to a very strong acquis, and so that international law applies in cyberspace and 11 norms. And basically anything that can make the acquis stronger would be good, and anything that would water it down would be bad. So that is our first goal, making the acquis stronger. And for example, we as the Netherlands have been a strong advocate of the norm to protect the public core of the internet, or the general availability and integrity of the internet. And that also means that current internet governance principles should be respected, and that governments should not be tempted to regulate elements of the public core, for example, root servers, which could bring the integrity and availability of the internet in danger. And this understanding and respecting it would make the acquis stronger. Just one example, and here you see also the link with what Heli just said on the ITU and internet governance. In general, we think that it is time to start focusing on implementation of the acquis, and we is the entire like-minded group and more countries. However, we also realize that part of the UN membership first needs to be socialized further with the current acquis. So that is the second goal that I see, and that is further socialization with the acquis. Our third goal for the open-ended working group is for more countries to be transparent about their interpretation of international law. And there are countries that are advocating for more legally binding measures, but they are not always transparent on their interpretation of international law and their assessment on what is currently missing in international law. So in other words, this transparency could create a better understanding of where we see consensus and what areas are problematic and need perhaps further clarification by the international community. And we as the Netherlands will of course continue to elaborate on our understanding of international law. And we have published our interpretation some years ago, but as the threat landscape is changing, our interpretation of international law also needs maintenance. So let me get back to implementation, because that is pivotal, and countries that are perhaps not so digitalized as yet, and or have not so actively engaged in the previous UN processes, have expressed that they need support with the implementation of the acquis. And we want to address this seriously and are ready to deliver, as we have shown previously that we're willing to do, for example, by establishing the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, which is a multi-stakeholder platform on capacity building. And that is why we, together with more than 55 co-sponsors, are in favor of a so-called program of action that is aimed at the implementation of the current acquis. And we believe this should be done in a dedicated track and not as part of a 5-year-long negotiation process. Of course, there should be logical links on substance between these processes, but negotiations are usually too political, whereas implementation can be done based on the current acquis without politicizing and in a truly multi-stakeholder way. Of course, the chair is very right when he wants to, when he says that he wants to deliver some tangible low-hanging fruit. And that would actually be my fourth goal. In the previous iteration of the open-ended working group, there seemed, for example, to be appetite for confidence-building measures, such as a point of contact network. And this could be an example of low-hanging fruit that we could explore. But that having said, of course, points of contact only work if they are being used. So there should be really political will to use them in a way to build confidence and perhaps to deconflict. Perhaps other colleagues would like to fill me in on the open-ended working group. There's a lot to be said on it, but let me leave it for now.
If there are any immediate points, please feel free to just unmute yourself. Otherwise, I would perhaps turn to some questions because it's precisely 4 o'clock. We have 30 minutes of your precious time that we still have. And I would like to turn to 2 questions. In the Q&A part, Thijs would like, I think, to ask a question about sanctions. Maybe that would be perfect for Thijs Barker, the head of our Technology and Global Affairs program here at the DGAP. Would like to ask a question on sanctions, I think, as I see, and maybe that would be very fitting for Heli. And then I can see another question in the chat, actually, which is a question for John on involving multi-stakeholders involved in the negotiations, whether they will be involved in the negotiations of the UN Cybercrime Convention. And I would like to ask now Thijs Barker and Oliver Week to unmute themselves and ask their question. Thijs, please.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you guys all for covering so much in so little time and to do it in a way that wasn't superficial. I'm really gaining a lot from this conversation. So one of the things that I guess I wrote 2 things in the chat, and I think they're kind of related. So Dimitri Alperovitch mentioned that we don't have a ransomware problem, we have a Russia problem, but it might even go beyond that, and it might even link to our like-minded spaces, and it might actually be an impunity problem, i.e. that we're not addressing some of the cyber operations or cyber attacks with proportional responses, and that creates an incentive structure that favors the attacker. So my question, specifically drilling down on this, was related to the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox, which was first, I think, activated or used last year after the 2015 Bundestag hack, and then has subsequently been used in other cases related to NotPetya and WannaCry. But I don't believe it's been used at all this year. And I was curious to know what the reason was that this instrument has not been deployed as cyber incidents in Europe increase in frequency and severity. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Oliver can follow up on that, so we can gather a couple of questions that will then be answered by the speakers.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, my name is Oliver Wieck. I'm from the International Chamber of Commerce. And my question was for John. Will this convention or the process, the negotiations, be a multi-stakeholder dialogue? Because I think the global business has a huge interest in the outcome of these negotiations, and it would be interesting to know if they will be involved into this process.
Thank you for the question. First, maybe Dimitri, then Heli, and John.
Well, the person asking the question, sorry, I couldn't catch the name, is absolutely right that there is an impunity problem. The reality is that the cost of launching cyber attacks, either at the state level or even at a criminal level, if you're operating out of certain jurisdictions such as Russia, but also Iran, North Korea, and China, are essentially zero or close to zero, because those states have not been willing to prosecute those criminals. In many cases, those criminals have actually been abated and working for the state. However, one of the critical things that we have not done is really hold these states accountable for essentially the principle that we established, at least the US government established after 9/11, is that if you're going to harbor, in that case, terrorists, we're going to hold you responsible for their actions. We have not done that with cybercrime. We have not done it with ransomware, even though we said that we would. The Biden administration has been very forceful in its rhetoric, both pre-Geneva summit with Vladimir Putin as well as post, but we have really not done anything to put additional pressure on Russia that would actually change the calculus for Vladimir Putin to start acting on these criminals. And clearly we have not done that with the other countries as well. At its core, I would argue that cyber is a geopolitics problem. It is no accident that most of the attacks that we're seeing in the West, either state-directed attacks or criminal-based attacks, are coming from 4 countries: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, because those are the 4 primary geopolitical adversaries that we face, whose state interests are diametrically opposed to ours on so many of the issues that we face in today's world. So cyber is just a spillover from that geopolitical contest, and until we wrap our arms around that problem and figure out how to manage the relationship with those states and tone down the nature of the geopolitical contest, I don't think that we will make much progress on cyber issues either.
Thank you. Maybe next will be the questions about sanctions and multi-stakeholder engagement.
Yeah.
Yes,
so,
please.
Valentin, do you want me to
yes,
say
please,
something?
the sanctions. Yeah. Yes, please.
Well, as a mother of the toolbox, I will maybe explain a bit how the toolbox came along in the EU. I think we have to understand the cyber diplomacy toolbox as the mainstreaming exercise. All these EU response activities in terms of sanctions, declarations, statements, démarches have been there like forever. It's just that the toolbox has put them together in one political framework and has labeled this as cyber diplomacy toolbox, so that everybody now understands that the same common foreign and security policy measures that have been available for the EU member states to respond to certain international security issues are now also usable in cyber. So it's been a huge mainstreaming exercise. And it has been actually used first already as early as 2018 with statements condemning NotPetya and WannaCry. It's not just sanctions. I think the toolbox, when you read this paper, has many tools, and sanctions are just one of them. And actually, in 2020, we used we applied sanctions twice as the European Union. First, in July, we applied sanctions on a number of attacks on different entities and individuals, and later on there was another set of sanctions related to the Bundestag hack. This year we condemned as the EU collectively certain activities before the German elections. And we can also say that, yes, this was using the toolbox. I think I refrain always from this saying that toolbox was used, but I would say that EU was able to respond collectively to certain activities or malicious cyber activities, showing its political will and resolve to step up to the perpetrators. I think this would be the more correct way of saying this and would convey that kind of political meaning. As the EU muscle memory on responding to malicious cyber activities, or EU member states muscle memory, has improved throughout those years when this political framework, what we now call toolbox, has been there. I think this we can see now. We are doing all the response activities more quickly. We are now having the next generation of the EU cyber strategy, which also foresees the strengthening of some of the measures in this toolbox, as everybody likes to call it. And we hope that our activities below the threshold will be more frequent and more serious, and will actually deter the malicious cyber operators. Because it is difficult to come up with response. As well, all of you know, most of the activities are below the threshold of armed attacks, and how we are going to deter activities like ransomware activities, like hacking elections. So it's not so clear-cut and it's not so easy. And for maybe those of you who haven't been working in multilateral organizations, I can assure you that having some sort of understanding on how we are going to use different diplomatic responses amongst 28 or 27 member states, it's quite an exercise. So maybe we should write a book about this, how easy actually it has been. So therefore, I think I see that the EU response is, of course, having still room for improvement, but it's still there. And I think it's the first time that the multilateral international organization is able, with such a wide membership, to actually come together and respond to cyber activities, so that malicious cyber activities. So therefore, I think EU here is certainly leading the way.
Thank you so much, Heli. John, question about multi-stakeholderism.
Yes, thank you, Valentin. Yes, I mean the involvement of multiple stakeholders is very important to us and also to our EU partners, and that's why this has really been an issue that we have been pushing very strongly for the past months, together with our allies and like-minded partners during the preparatory talks that we're having in Vienna. So this has been an issue that we've always brought up. We've always brought up to the attention of the chair and to the other members of the group. And what we would really like to see is have multiple stakeholders, meaning really representatives of industry, of the academia, and also of civil society in the room during the negotiations, with the possibility to actually make interventions, make comments, bring in their points in a direct way to make sure that all their contributions become part of the negotiations. And at this point, I'm not sure if we will actually manage to get through with those requests. What has happened in a practical way is that there has been a call for all interested stakeholders to register their interest in following the negotiations. And actually the German government has just sent out this call for stakeholders to get involved a couple of weeks ago. And now we're waiting for responses. Everyone is allowed to register his interest with United Nations. But what we will then see is a consensus seeking among state parties whether these actors are allowed into the room or not. And that will be very difficult, because we know that a couple of countries don't want to have these multiple stakeholders in the room. So we're not there yet. And this is a big issue to be resolved ahead of the start of formal negotiations in January.
Thank you for really showing us a strong wish and also undertakings that you're doing in order to bring in also multi-stakeholder community, which is also part of this audience, of course. So there's definitely interest from there to provide their viewpoints and their wishes. I think the next question in the Q&A chat is geared towards, or I think Michael Chertoff would be very well suited to answer this question. It's really about Russia and whether the independent criminals, the closeness of the independent criminals to the state, if we can maybe already say that sometimes it is actually the state acting. And I would like here to ask actually Moritz Kleff to ask the question, if you're still here. Yes, Moritz Kleff, if I didn't butcher your question, please ask a question, or if you're not here anymore, if everything is good, okay, but in a public place, okay. Well, so the question is really about proximity of the cyber criminals specifically to the Russian government. Is it actually state activity, or is it actually independent criminals? Okay, independent criminals acting with impunity. And the second question, a follow-up question from Moritz, is if language speaking capabilities, Russian, Chinese, and etc., and so on, play a role in the Western response through law enforcement or intelligence services. So it's about proxies and about to what extent language capabilities here play a role in Western response. Please.
So yes, thank you, Valentin. So let me first say that I think that when you look at the Russian government and its relationship with criminal groups that are engaged in this hacking activity, you have to look at it on a sliding scale. The US intelligence community has publicly attributed the SolarWinds hack, which obviously affected the supply chain, to Russian intelligence, and said that they were responsible for this because it gave them the ability, as I said earlier, to exploit the vulnerability in the future. In other instances, I think what we've seen is a kind of a tacit understanding by the Russian government that as long as criminal activity is not carried out against Russian institutions, criminal groups will be tolerated, provided that they're available to help the Russian government when the intelligence community wants that help. So it's not an all or nothing or binary situation, but it's rather a circumstance where you can look at criminal groups as being in effect standby groups or indirect agents that can carry out the wishes of the government. This goes back, by the way, all the way to the attack on Estonia back in I think 2007 when I was in office, where there was a cyber attack that shut down parts of the government and the financial system in response to the actions pulling down a statue memorializing the Soviet Union during the Second World War. And when we called out the Russians on doing this, the government said, oh, it's not us, it's patriotic hackers. So there's an element of deniability there. And I think therefore it becomes a question of being practical in deciding how to attribute, and also in deciding when you can hold a nation state accountable for failing to take action. And that brings me to the second point. I think the issue that we faced in the intelligence community vis-a-vis Russian hacking and Chinese hacking is not just a language issue, but for many years, the intelligence community, since September 11th, was understandably focused on counterterrorism. And that meant a lot of the effort in recruitment and in training was directed at getting people to be able to operate in parts of the Middle East where we were dealing with jihadi threats. And that was a language issue, but it was also a kind of a geopolitical focus issue. And it may be that our geopolitical focus on Russia and China was diminished or distracted by that very singular, understandable concern with terrorism. And so we may have missed the boat or been late to the party in seeing that what Russia and China were going to be doing over the last 5 years is moving into a much more active stance in geopolitical conflict, including what we sometimes call hybrid warfare. I will say, I think the intelligence community now realizes that strategic intelligence, as well as tactical intelligence about Russian and Chinese rivalry, is got to be at the top of the list of priorities. And I think we're going to see it over the next years or so, a continued investment in training, education, and acculturation of the community to understanding what is going on in Russia and in China, and to continue, obviously, to be concerned about the Middle East as well.
Thank you so much for the also the sliding scale example and all these very wise insights, and also that terrorism kind of drained away the attention from the problems that we're facing currently. I think it was in the UK where they have actually taken in again retired people with Russia expertise who was very much used during the Cold War. So there's different techniques of bringing again people in with their expertise, but there needs to be more skills to be built. I'd like to turn now to a question which was put towards Mr. Alperovitch. It's again regarding the Russia problem. Do you think that things may actually change with the new UN Convention on Cybercrime, which could also oblige Russia to arrest cyber criminals, especially since Russia is so active in the UN cybercrime discussions that we've already heard a couple of times during this conversation? What's your take on this?
No, I don't think anything will change. Russia is part of quite a few conventions that it has violated lately, including the Chemical Weapons Convention, and obviously it has been caught using chemical weapons to assassinate dissidents and those that it sees as opposed to the regime, and traitors to their intelligence services. It has invaded another territory, of course, and helped shut down a civilian airliner. Russia has made a lot of statements, including in its summit with Biden in Geneva, that it does not tolerate cybercrime and it prosecutes it aggressively. And yet the evidence is quite clear that even when individuals are identified, even when indictments are laid out in quite a degree of detail by US government about certain individuals that are living openly in Russia, they're not even being questioned by Russian intelligence services. So I don't think that being part of another convention is going to change their calculus. I think it is possible to change their thinking on this issue by convincing them that the costs of tolerating this activity are very high and that it does not serve Russia's interest, but we have simply not succeeded in doing so just yet.
So we have around 8 minutes left till the end of this session. So I will ask everyone who's in the discussion to still think about last minute questions if there's anything you need to ask now, because soon the opportunity will be gone. At the same time, if any of the speakers would like to reply to anything that's been said, would like to complement anything on the different topics, please feel free. There is now still a bit of time to perhaps deepen the discussion on previous issues, to give any replies, maybe something you didn't disagree, something that you think should be, you disagree but should be emphasized, maybe more recommendations on how to tackle 2022.
Valentin, this is Michael Chertoff. So you had indicated you wanted me to address briefly what I'm worried about coming down the horizon. And let me just give you 3 issues I think we ought to watch. One is, there's a lot of discussion about quantum computing. And I don't think we're on the verge of operationalizing that yet, but I know the Chinese are very invested in it. And, the West is as well. The concern is much of our security is built around encryption. And if in fact quantum computing becomes a tool that undermines encryption because of the ability to dramatically increase the capability of analyzing alternative sequences in order to decrypt things, that could undermine a lot of the security measures that we take for granted. And that's particularly true in the financial community. And I know that in the US, the authorities are, again, looking at people being prepared for what would be their resilience approach if, in fact, quantum computing started to undermine the value of encryption. Second issue is the Internet of Things. As we proliferate smart devices like refrigerators, cameras, thermostats, we increasingly see that they are very poorly designed from a security standpoint, and many of them have been mobilized in various cases into mega botnets that dramatically increase the scale of what we used to see as botnets that were relying on classic PCs or computers as the elements of the botnet. So building security by design in these issues, in these smart things, is going to become a very critical issue if we're not going to expand the surface area through which attacks take place. Finally, increasingly, fintech is looking at blockchain and cryptocurrencies as alternative forms of money. And that's an interesting development. But again, my experience watching these technologies grow over the years is you've got to ask yourself, what happens if there's a vulnerability or if it's not as secure as people think? And I would say one example is the ransomware actors in Colonial Pipeline must have been surprised to see that some of the ransom money they had received was taken back because they were able to find the wallet in which the cryptocurrencies were being held. So I think these are some of the issues we need to think about going forward.
Thank you so much, Michael. I would maybe add here two more questions as we're wrapping up. I would like to hear from perhaps from Nathalie and Heli what they think, whether really where Western countries are lagging behind in cyber diplomacy discussions. We have seen the DGE being shelved. We have seen Russia putting forward leading the efforts on the Cybercrime Convention. And so it seems that you have mentioned the program of action and so on. So maybe you can just say a bit what your sense is of those discussions, whether you know how that is panning out. And then I would like to ask John, maybe to close, because next year will be the G7, which will be hosted by Germany. Maybe you can tell us what is awaiting us in the cyber context. Please, Nathalie or Heli, whichever wants to go first, perhaps Nathalie. Yeah. Oh, we can't hear, I think.
Sorry, yeah, yes. I was pushing
the
wrong unmute button. Thanks. Yeah, on cyber diplomacy, obviously you mentioned the multilateral processes. I think what is also key is our outreach to other countries in a bilateral way, perhaps in a regional way. And we do that in regional settings. And then, of course, it really strikes me that a lot of countries are actually on similar pages as the like-minded are, and do share similar concerns about the threat landscape, but also the way forward. So that actually gives me hope. I think in terms of sort of my big worry is that we're basically in this fight between democratic countries and more totalitarian states. And of course, a lot of countries are not sort of willing to choose, and they just want to be able to reap the benefits of digitalization and be able to use an open, free, safe, and secure internet. And I think as EU, we have been rather successful in setting some of the standards in the world to protect privacy, and like, for example, with the GDPR, that is being looked at by various other countries as something that they could adopt. And the same goes for developments on the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, that is still under consideration. But those are developments that could have a huge standard setting impact. And of course, these considerations and these legislation is being developed with input of the various multi-stakeholders. So I wouldn't agree with your assessment that the West is sort of lagging behind. Thank you.
Heli, please.
Yes, I would like to also share Nathalie's optimistic comment. Well, you know, we in the Northern Europe, we are all the optimists because we always have cold weather and it's raining and snowing all the time. But actually, I wanted to say something which makes sense maybe for all of the cyber community, and especially it makes sense for us diplomats when we are looking at the developing countries and development assistance questions. There is one thing that we are all lacking, which is we do not have enough cyber experts and enough expertise in our Western countries and also in the developing nations. So I think this is a collective task we need to do in 2022 to make sure that we create more expertise and how we can do this and what kind of measures and what kind of programs and projects we can put together would be a good idea to start thinking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heli. And now, please, John, to give us an outlook on shortly on the G7, then we'll close. We're right at 30. Thank you.
Sure, Valentin. It's a pleasure to talk about G7. And we're looking forward to our presidency starting in January. But let me also say that our G7 team is incredibly discreet, or one could even say secretive, about what they are planning for our presidency. And they would kill me if I really went into any details of our plans, because they've also told me that it's very bad style to talk about your own plans while your other G7 partner still holds the presidency. And of course, we still have the UK presidency coming to its grand finale. We have the meeting of G7 foreign ministers in Liverpool starting on the 10th of December, which might actually be one of the first meetings on the schedule of our new foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who we are all waiting to join us. And but what I can say, of course, is that cyber will need to be part of our G7 agenda. It's just become too central to international security. So we will need to cover cyber in a way. And of course, what may happen is that we have something current coming up, like this year, the ransomware attacks that really forced the international community to respond. So that may be something that we will just need to keep on our agenda. We will need to make sure that we are agile enough to respond to anything that happens once we start the presidency in the cyber field. And the other thing that I believe we will try and take forward in the G7 is the cyber capacity building, because the G7 are just a great group of countries in terms of their expertise, of their cyber infrastructure. And it would just be great to be able to pool all those resources that we have in that circle and to put them to good end in this whole field of cyber capacity building. So I could picture ourselves doing something in that respect, but unfortunately, I can't share any more details at this point.
Thank you so much for being even very diplomatically sharing as much as you can, and perhaps giving us some vague insights into how which direction it may go. Thank you. We are 3 minutes over. It's 4:33. It's already dark here. Probably also where you are, or it's getting lighter and lighter if you're in the US or elsewhere. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your precious time. I know you're very busy. Thank you for being here, for your comments, and for giving us an outlook of what is expecting us in 2022. So we won't be reactive next year, but rather proactive, which is always a good New Year's resolution. In any case, thank you to everyone also who was here. Thank you for Rolf Nikel for the welcome in the beginning. And I hope to see you very soon at another of our events, and one day also in person again. Have a good day. Bye-bye.